He is the author of The Atlas of the End of the World, a framework that audits present status of humankind in the frame of the Earth system. Specific reference is to space production and metabolic management. Professor Weller will elaborate on the notion of peri-urban by presenting his research on booming centers in ecological hotspot regions, regions containing the world's paramount and most endangered stocks of genetic heritage and vitality. His reflection culminates in his recent proposal for the creation of a world park, a visionary project representative of a radical change of approach in the disciplines of planning, designing, and spacemaking. I will now leave the stage to the first of our speakers, Professor Mehrotra. Welcome.
Thank you, Roberto. Very good to see you. Thank you for your kind words. I'm rather overwhelmed speaking at a conference of landscape architects. So I might be the odd one in the room, especially with Richard following. But I'll try to do my best and share with you work. And I hope it is relevant to some of the questions that you've outlined. So thank you very much for the invitation, and pleasure and honor to be here. With that, I'm going to go on to full screen. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. So I have titled this, just inspired by your title of Transitional Landscapes. I've called this Architecture in a Time of Flux. I'm essentially a practitioner, but I also am interested in urban questions and urbanism more broadly, which is the focus of my academic work. So I think the idea of flux, of movement, I think for various reasons ranging from our perception or construction of the rubric of climate change to other forms of inequity, I think have put our planet in a condition of flux. And this is again from the lens of an urbanist, of the movement of people, of fluctuation. And so therefore I'm going to kind of use that imagination of the human being at the center of this in trying to share with you some of these readings. A map that surfaced in the Rotterdam Biennale a few years ago, made by Dutch architects, showed this wonderful separation of economy and population, where 73% of the world's population, 73% of the world's economy resides with 14% of the world's population, and 86% of the world's population, engages with 27% of the world's economy. And it's sort of, you could. We use global north, global south, and many of these sorts of binaries in very easy ways. But I mean, they have huge implication. And I think what was interesting about this map was the fact that they drew out the most contentious borders, which exactly and very accurately map upon these differences and become the sites of real contestation. The term I prefer using is one that was coined and introduced by Shahidul Alam, who is a photographer and an activist and a photographer from Bangladesh. And he used this in the context of a biennale I think he was organizing, where he called it the majority world, which is where the majority of the world's population resides. And of course, this has massive implications. And one can even unpack and look at terms like megacities and how they emanate from metrics that, say, the World Bank and IMF established of thresholds of 5 and 7 million people related to infrastructure, transportation, funding, capacities. But the metric of people in space is actually an important one for us to also focus on. And this flux that I was talking about occurs, of course, for many reasons. These migration patterns are partly economical, partly political, and sometimes cultural, or not largely, but often cultural, or driven by cultural sort of callings. And then at these moments of conflicts and resistance, these are the kinds of images that appear today in the world. And so human beings become very central in this imagination of what this flux might be. If I just look at India, I'm going to take that as a case, and I hope some of the kinds of findings from our research also resonate more broadly, for other parts of the world. But I mean, the rural-urban binary is kind of defunct now. Is it productive? I don't think at all. And in India, I even sort of ask what might be urban. One doesn't quite know. It's been described as an incomplete process of urbanization. But I think it's this flux that sort of explains it in I think more compelling ways, at least to my mind. So if we just look at what is urban in India, the three criteria the government uses to construct what might be, or construct a reading of what might be urban in terms of what are towns. And the three criteria they use, and by the way, these criteria have histories which would be a lecture in itself. Some of these histories are political, but it's more complicated. But anyway, this is something we've inherited, and now we use these three criteria to define what is called urban. One is a population of over 5,000 people in a place. The second is a density, which is about 400 persons per square kilometers is what they define. And the third, which is very bizarre, is that over 75% of the male population is in non-agricultural employment. And so if a settlement, I'm not calling it a town or a city, if a settlement meets these three criteria, then it gets classified as a census town, which means it's a town that's counted in the census. And the implication of that is you get infrastructure, support from the central government. Again, there are many nuances here in terms of the state and the center, and the incentives and the disincentives to be urban and rural in terms of funding possibilities. So it's many of those politics that come together to leave this as a very bizarre and a static set of criteria. And the 75% male population in non-agricultural employment is very bizarre because, again, of the flux that I'm talking about. Employment is divided annually, and so therefore there are very few spots in the country now where this would even be a truism. So if you look at the three criteria, you get about 7,523. This has grown a little bit. My numbers are a couple of years old. Towns, which are represented as these sort of bounded entities, dots of different sizes, which give you a sense of their distribution. And then, of course, they are further broken down based on population, etc. But if I begin to unpack each of these criteria, and we look at just the question of population, then these are the number of places in India which have a population of 5,000 people. And you see accumulations along the coast, but also in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. And only if this one criteria is used, India is almost 50% urban in 2011, 47%, which would have been by now that. If you took the criteria of density, which is 400 people per square kilometer, actually the Indo-Gangetic Plain is the world's biggest megacity of continuous urbanism, which goes all the way from Kashmir down to Kolkata and to the delta there. And then, of course, you see this in the coastal region. But if you use the third criteria, which is 75% of the male working population in non-agricultural labor, actually the world's biggest megacity is all rural. It's not even a city, and very little pockets are even qualified to be urban. And so essentially, I mean, I think the point is that how these three criteria come together, why only these criteria, what it means when you get such contradictions in just two criteria in that reading is interesting. Now, if you superimpose on this, and this is current research I'm doing with my colleague Saurav Bishwas, which will be the form of a book soon. But if you begin to start overlaying, say, cropping seasons, rice growing areas, the railway networks, you begin to start understanding this flux between towns, between seasonal change, between when people move. This is wheat growing, that's rice growing, quite different. They create different kinds of hinterlands in terms of the economy and the movement of people, and how this agrarian field really connects to what we call the urban field in a sense. So, I mean, I think the point of all of this is that when you have this kind of disparity, you clearly have people moving between places in enormous numbers. And our own kind of thumb rule sense of this is that there are about 300 million people in India that move on a seasonal pattern. When we had the pandemic and we had 48-hour notice and the country was closed down, in 1 week, 30 million people, what they called in India reverse migration, where people migrated out of the cities back to their villages. It was 30 million people who moved in a week. If that's an indication, then the 300 million people moving annually might not be a number that's very off. And that is a massive sort of number just as a metric. We then go to this sort of idea of the binaries that we construct to understand the world around us. Very useful to understand and organize these problems, but non-productive. Design is about synthesis. Design is about actually creating a blur, as I would describe it, between these sorts of binaries. And in this condition of flux, the binaries actually become even more non-productive because the blur occurs in daily, annual, and annual cycles for the reasons and in the patterns that I described. And I'm taking India, but I know I've seen studies on Italy, for example. I've seen studies for other parts where the sense of flux is becoming more palpable and is going to really challenge our imagination of planning, landscape design, or landscape imaginations in the broadest sort of sense. And of course, there are many other layers that you can sort of apply here to understand this. So when the flux lands on the ground, really what you get is these sorts of disparities where actually the meaning of what you see in the image or the image and its meaning are differentiated, right? So what you see here and you imagine as the informal city at the base of what is the formal city, I would argue that a large part of that population in the informal city are employed actually in the formal economy and vice versa. And so this is where you have a detachment between form, meaning, and form, image, and meaning. And I think that is an important difference, actually, because it challenges many business as usual ways that we imagine these sorts of environments. And so I call this the kinetic city. It's a city that is unstable in some ways. It's a city that's characterized by a sense of elasticity, incrementalism. It's about the appropriation, reappropriation, deappropriation of space on a temporal cycle. And it's about soft thresholds. It's a thresholds blur. Thresholds become porous. I mean, the threshold itself as an idea sometimes disappears. And it is incremental, and it is very small moves that occur over temporal cycles that result in the forming of really both the image as well as the DNA of the city. I mean, there are many examples of this, of even elasticity. A regular street in Mumbai, which for festivals for 10 days gets converted into a community hall, but it's made out of plaster of Paris. It's dismantleable. There's a large community hall here where 5,000 people can be seated. They watch films, they celebrate. And this particular one is from the Ganesh festival in Mumbai. And 10 days later or 12 days later, it's dismantled and the street, resumes its kind of anonymous sort of nature in some ways. And this also happens in other conditions like, these fields where cricket, this wonderful Indian game that the British invented, is played with great passion. But in the evenings, the same spot becomes the venue for a wedding. And the wedding is constructed out of cloth and bamboo, or the venue for the wedding is constructed of cloth and bamboo. You see the cricket pitch is not touched because it's sacred. That's sort of cultural understanding there. And the club members and the wedding guests, both they share tea from the same temporary kitchen that you see under the brown jute canopy. And in the morning, it goes back to its own original condition. And so that's a kind of elastic condition where unimagined uses are inscribed on space. And there are numerous examples of this where formal infrastructure is leveraged in a way for informal operations of economy, of cultural practices, etc. But it's elastic in that it kind of resumes its original form on this temporal scale. And so here, even architecture is not the single spectacle by which the city is defined. Here, festivals become spectacles. In this case, the Ganesh festival, which is a big one. And here, on the last day, when this idol is immersed in the water after 10 days of celebration, immersion becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because here, as the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no permanent or static mechanisms to encode the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process in space, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain memory as static or permanent entities. And the city and its architecture don't even contain the same meaning. So here, within what I'm calling the kinetic city, meanings are not stable, spaces get consumed, reinterpreted, recycled. And in a sense, the kinetic city recycles the static city to create these new spectacles. And so this is a different condition versus where architecture is the singular defining kind of spectacle for the city, often brittle form. I call these the landscapes of impatient capital, and this is the architecture of impatient capital. Capital is inherently impatient, and so places that offer least friction and allow it to manifest its value through these brittle forms, where architects are left to twisting and turning buildings when vendors drive the process of construction. You get a completely different imagination of the city, versus here, where architecture is not the single spectacle of the city. This is an image I'll come back to if I have time, but this is from one of our projects, and I quote Martha Chen, who is an authority on informal economy. And she wrote this in the context of economy, but when I saw this image, and I'll try to talk about the project if we have time, I realized that it resonated very deeply, even for me as an architect. And what she said was, and I quote her, "What is needed most fundamentally is a new economic paradigm, a model of a hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small scale and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and the most powerful economic players." And I think this has resonance in the way we as professionals, architects, landscape architects, and planners can imagine a world that now sort of surrounds us. My colleague, Joan Busquets at the GSD, has this wonderful diagram where he shows us how, urbanization, plot division, and building, which are the three kinds of processes that come together to make at least the built environment of the city. In the traditional city, it was this kind of linear process, and now in informal housing, there's a complete flip. In between housing estates, these collapse and they're delivered concurrently. But in informal housing, which is now what comprises a large part of this planet, buildings occur first, plot division or legitimization of property ownership, and then infrastructure, which is urbanization here. So there's a reversal. We've turned everything on its head. And so what does that mean? And so this challenges the idea of the city as a static and a stable entity. It is not that imagination that is useful any longer from both perspectives, or from multiple perspectives. But if you use the perspective or the lens of putting the human being at the center of this imagination, with at least what's happening from my own work that I realize in India, but also if you use the lens of landscape and ecology more broadly, and natural systems and how they operate, to imagine the city and to privilege the city and its built environment as the static driver of what might self-organize or otherwise organize around it, is a mistake. And I think that that reversal is very critical. And this is the work that I think, for me at least, was clarified, which wasn't the intention when we embarked on this project, through what Roberto referred to as the Kumbh Mela project, which we call mapping the ephemeral megacity. This was done for other reasons, but extracting from it, I think, is a reinforcement of this sort of challenging the notion of the city as a static entity. And so this was a cross-university project, a very interesting one, where we looked at the Kumbh Mela, which is a religious festival. It occurs on 4-year cycles, but the meta ones, the big ones, occur on 12-year cycles based on alignments of planets and various other things. It results in millions of people coming to the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers to bathe on about 5 sacred days, where these alignments, planetary alignments, are complete. And on this sort of terrain, this is a Google image which was captured in the monsoon, where you see the river in its full fury. But then by October, the waters recede, and by November, the sandbars emerge. And by December, in 8 weeks, starting planning in late October and finishing on the 15th of January, roughly, a whole city emerges on the banks of the river. It's the world's lightest megacity. It's designed to have 5 to 7 million people reside there for 55 days, and it has visitors that it is estimated go up to about 100 million people on those 5 sacred days to bathe. And so this is, that's why we called it mapping the ephemeral megacity. And that's a before and after image, where the top image is something I took in, I think it was in late September, early October, where the waters were yet, were flooding up to the banks. And then the bottom image I took when we arrived there on the 11th of January, a few months later, where a whole city, from the same spot you viewed, a whole city that had emerged. And this is, one can't call it a pop-up city. This is a deliberately planned city. It employs a grid, which is overlaid on the sandbar. What is very robust about this is that grid extends across the river. Every street of the grid extends across the river in the form of a pontoon bridge. So that allows for the river to be volatile if there's an unseasonal rain or downpour, or upstream if the dam, they release water, which they do in a way to flush the river to keep its condition sanitary. But the bridges allow that kind of robustness. So it's a very deliberately planned, and it replicates all aspects of a regular city in terms of both social as well as physical infrastructure. It really does replicate that, because it is humongous if you think about it in terms of people on space. And the core of it, in comparison to Manhattan, is about that scale. So you almost imagine Manhattan with every street going across as a bridge, the kind of robustness you'd get in terms of circulatory systems and relationships would be enormous. And everything above the ground, there are really no foundations. There's very little below the ground except septic tanks. It's very light. And this was one of the interesting findings, that we realized that everything was made above ground using 5 materials, which is 8-foot-tall bamboo, something to secure and tie it, screws, nails, string, rope, skinning material, which could be galvanized metal sheet, or it could be canvas, or it could be beautiful fabric. And this sort of modular kit of baths actually ramped up to scale, to go all the way from a little tent, which a little family, or a small family, would occupy, or a large temple, which could which could contain all sorts of ceremonies, but it could easily house 1,000 or 2,000 people. So the scale variations are quite enormous, and it's actually the same 5 materials which take on completely different configurations depending. And here, this is a temple which is sort of clad in a completely different way, with different patterns, creating different kinds of illusions, or a more rudimentary memorial here to soldiers, which is just made in thatch and bamboo, and has the possibility of 100 prayer ceremonies occurring simultaneously. What is amazing about this sort of plant is also its governance structure, which is that the governance hierarchies are also they also shift on a temporal scale. And so it starts top down with the chief minister of the state, with his top bureaucrats in this case, appointing people, aligning things a year in time. Then at some point, the bureaucrats take over, and these are technocrats who are aligning infrastructure needs, making projections of population, and all of that. And then 6 months before it actually hits the ground, the whole pyramid shifts. And the person who becomes in charge of it is the divisional commissioner, who begins to then appoint what is a commissioner for the actual festival itself. And therefore, then the person on the ground he is, let's say, the mayor of the city, he is, now he has the ability to go outside the circle, but he reports only to 2 people. So decisions can be made very quickly. And so this shifting on a temporal scale of the governance system itself is rather mind-blowing, because, I think in the context of urbanization today, especially as we look at this kind of transitional condition, what is interesting is that sometimes the governance systems of cities are harder to shed off than the physical plant of cities. And some of these have great redundancies and are not nimble. And that's why cities don't have the ability often to respond to crisis, because the bureaucracy itself comes in the way, because these hierarchies are intended with this imagination that the city does not deal with flux, and the city is a very stable entity. And that's how projections, but also aspirations, resources, and systems respond to that kind of aspirational condition. In any case, on the last day of the 55 days, there's a massive prayer ceremony, offerings to the mother Ganges, and the festival comes to a close. And within 3 days, everything disappears. Within 10 days, what is left are little bits of infrastructure. All those light poles or electricity poles get recycled and they go to smaller villages in the hinterland. So there's a kind of very interesting material geography of where resources come from and how they get redistributed. But they all get absolutely used. And what is left are these thatch mats, which would have been the base of tents or dormitories for people to sleep in, which sort of decompose very easily once the river sort of swells again. And all that is left is a memory and a remnant and a footprint of some of these streets. And so it goes back by the monsoon into the natural landscape it was, leaving no kind of remnant. And so this sort of sense of reversibility is quite amazing. It's a light city. It sits with minimal infrastructure. And of course, my argument is not we should make our cities like this, but I think what we can learn from this is how temporality, how transitional thinking, and how we can make space within our regular urban systems, our regular imaginations of the meta regions, as Roberto used that term, can actually make space for these occurrences. So it's the sort of idea that the static need not be our only imagination. And like I said, this is a formal city, although it might look like an informal city. It's intentional, it's deliberate. It's not a pop-up city, as one might sort of describe these phenomena and then reside in that one part of the binary, which is the informal. And so this became a provocation for us in the Venice Biennale maybe 2 cycles ago, where we called the installation Does Permanence Matter? But we also expanded this to look at this research on ephemeral urbanism and this question of does permanence matter, and created a taxonomy where we felt you could actually organize this around the landscapes of transaction, religion, strife, military, refuge, celebration, and extraction. In extraction in Chile, for example, copper mines and the towns around them, they are abandoned after 50 years. So in each one of these components of the taxonomy, the temporal dimensions and the temporal cycles are different, but they could be productive in what we can learn from these in ways we embed this imagination within the business as usual imaginations of these peri-urban larger meta regions that we look at. And I think this could be a productive category for us to really expand those imaginations as we think more ecologically about all of this in productive ways. And so therefore it also brings us to the question about the design of transitions and not of absolute solutions. There is too much in our current pedagogy which is premised on the notion of end state or the notion of absolute solutions, and actually the design of transitions is complicated, and I think it's a frame in itself which we obviously need to take more seriously. So I'm kind of halfway through my presentation, and what I have chosen to do, and that's why it makes me nervous talking to landscape architects, is to say that with this kind of set of questions, at least, I mean, I can't make exact correlations, as Roberto suggested, between some of our projects and this thinking, but of course it has influenced the way we think about our own work and of how we might think about transitions. And so this is yet exploratory, but I'd like to just share this with you, and I hope it might, add to the conversation in the conference. And so I go back to that map, and so what are the implications when you have these divisions? Of course, we know when you have a majority of the population with such a small part of the economy, there's issues of, housing, and poverty plays itself out in the built environment, and there are many practices that emanate from that condition. But of course, one big one is sanitation. And what was remarkable is when we did this mapping of sanitation globally, where we looked at malaria, we looked at water stress, we looked at child malnutrition. What was fascinating was that it actually mapped almost accurately in relation to that map that I showed you before this. And so this is a much more fine-grained mapping of those concentration, where these concentrations of issues happen. And the water stress is the only thing that sort of jumps beyond just the global south or the majority world, and also is affecting some parts of Europe and other places. And then, of course, we took this sort of idea and mapped it further, looking at India by district. And again, what was fascinating was that the concentration was all in the Indo-Gangetic plain, which is where, as I showed you in the earlier research, is where a majority of the population resides, and that's like the world's biggest megacity. And it lacks, because a lot of those towns don't qualify as census towns because they don't meet the three criteria, mainly because everyone there is employed in agriculture and goes into the city to work in other seasons. You don't get the classification, therefore you don't get the infrastructure investment, and therefore you have massive sanitation problems which have results on public health. And so therefore, these are also lenses beyond just sort of landscape and natural systems, but of course they intersect and the implications are amazingly fine-grained. But this sort of gives you a read at this territorial scale of how these sort of conflicts, and then when that hits the ground, this is what you get. And so sanitation is a massive issue, and related to that is open defecation, which has huge public health implications. And this is an image of a boy jumping out of Dharavi, which is Mumbai's biggest slum, and it always occurred to me, it's an image I took accidentally. I was actually waiting for him to hop off and take an image of what was in the background, because this is one of the so-called open spaces for the slum, which, as you see, don't really get used. But he seems so intact with his white socks, a smile on his face, but he has defecated in the open because he's got no access to toilets. And so, it's ridiculous if you look at this. Even the Bombay Municipal Corporation, its target is 1:50, which means 6 families would have to use 1 WC, which is so ridiculous. The Prime Minister of India's ambition has been, or had been, by 2019 to have a toilet in every house, because we have the largest open defecation. Of course, that didn't happen. And the problem is, how would you get a toilet into a landscape like that? And so what is being done is massive amounts of toilets are being built and shipped to villages and small towns, as you can see this blue box. and the septic tank in front of it. Now, this is what I mean by an absolute solution. This is an absolute solution. It's driven by numbers. These are the most, let's say, permanent pieces of infrastructure in the village or the small town. As you can see, the house is made out of mud and thatch, but not even mud, it's actually reeds which have a mud plaster on it. And the toilet is, and studies have shown that yes, some people are using these toilets. Most people yet prefer to go out and defecate in the field. And these are actually like big storage cupboards. So people actually store jewelry and food in these toilets because that's the only thing they can really lock. And so this is where design thinking is completely absent, and it became an absolute solution. So therefore, we have to think of transitions before we can imagine transformations, because to make transformations, we have to design the transition, because these solutions will not come with end state absolute thinking. And so, of course, the government does community toilets, and I think community toilets is a form of transitional thinking, because the problem of housing is related to how sanitation can sort of be integrated with that system. So as a holding strategy, the community toilets perhaps are a transitional solution. So this is an example of a transitional solution, and we began to sort of take this one seriously and address it. And we worked with an NGO who was responsible for constructing these sorts of toilets, which was funded by the World Bank. They had specifications of using concrete, all sorts of limitations. And we rethought that prototype, where we stacked it for reasons of safety for women and children, with the ground floor for men, the upper level for children and women. We added the caretaker's house on the top as a way of creating an identification. We created a community space on top, and we sort of proposed solar panels that would take it off the grid so the community space could be used in other productive ways. We had a very hard time getting this through because the government thought it was an iconic project, and they had ideas of, in public-private partnerships to develop that piece of land. They didn't want people squatting there to organize themselves. So there were all sorts of complexities, which again is the subject of a whole lecture, so I won't go into that. But after much struggle, we managed to build one. It became this community space. It became a place for kids to study. You see the public housing in the background in that image with the yellow wall. That never got occupied for 15 years. So that's why it tells you how important design is, and why people prefer to live in self-made homes, because they respond to their social networks, they respond to their needs in a funny way much better. And so this sort of was an experiment which actually failed, and it failed for various reasons. Again, I'm happy to discuss them if we have time. And one has to keep trying. And I think it failed largely because these were implants. We were riding into the project with an NGO who was working in a kind of centralized kind of structure of the World Bank funding, the government sponsoring them. So it wasn't a bottom-up thing. And so I think, of course, again, one can reflect on all of that and learn from it, which we did, and we continued to work. This is the first prize in an international competition that we got, which was funded by the Gates Foundation, to look at it, where here we began to embed it much more within the community fabric. And of course, again, this didn't get built, but we also began to move away from it being a kind of mono functional infrastructure imagination to include, water filtration and sailor water, a laundromat, and all sorts of. So we began to imagine it as a sanitation hub, not as a community toilet, which we are now working on the ground in India to actually develop in reality. But this was this is about 12 years ago, or 14 years ago, where it was imagined as a sanitation hub. And provocatively, we also placed the hub across the square from the temple in a way to, bring both these into notice. But what we learned from this was that, of course, community toilets, if you imagine toilets as an architect and don't place it within this larger ecology of sanitation, is doomed to fail. And the community toilets is a form of a transitional solution, but again has to be imagined within this broader ecology of sanitation, but also then within the ecology of implementation, which is also highly complex. And where does one sit in this? The NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, the foundations, academia are all on the fringe of this, and we are, as practitioners even more on the fringe of it. So where we situate ourselves within this ecology becomes another very important question. And so therefore transitional landscapes have to be imagined in this sort of way of even the landscapes of governance, and the landscapes in the case of the ecology of sanitation, of the problems that we are trying to address. And I think then that becomes sort of proportionate to our imagination also at looking at these larger mega regions, hinterlands, and other such sort of formations of the urban, but also of natural systems and landscapes. So to come down to a slightly smaller scale is a corporate building. And here again, this is a peri-urban condition where suddenly this capital, global capital, is all arriving because it's frictionless territory and people can build very easily. And so this was a project we did for an infrastructure company. It was interesting because this is a high-tech infrastructure company that builds highways, roads, bridges. They have this control room where they monitor all their work, and they have cameras on all their equipment. And of course, they wanted a corporate building. They showed us many buildings like this in Hyderabad. And Hyderabad at that time was politically very contested because they were trying to divide the state. And what I found really amusing was all these buildings where this is Mercedes-Benz. You can see the logo on the door on the ground floor. It's very subtle. But when the vendors who sell you curtain glazing sell you their products, they also give you fishing nets free, so you can protect the building from people who are rioting or throwing stones at the glass. And that for me was just mind-blowing, to think that these images were so powerful, this tyranny of images of what global capital had to represent in these terrains, which otherwise had a vernacular and a tradition that's quite different. And how do you kind of reconcile these? We were very inspired by this little hut, which is actually a water cooler. 200 of these are constructed in Jaipur every summer. And that guy works for the Business Association NGO that does this. And he's put his kettle out, which means he's ready to serve people water. It's free of charge. There are no plastic cups. People cup their hand, drink water, smile and gratitude, and go away. And every once in a while, this man who works comes out and he humidifies the hut. And through evaporative cooling, the hut stays cool so that he can be comfortable in the hut. But within the hut, the water is also stored in earthen pots. And these earthen pots, because they're porous, through evaporative cooling, keep the water very cool. And the combination was so beautiful and so inspiring, and such a lovely human gesture. Again, putting the human being at the center of these imaginations. One was inspired to do a corporate building using this principle, and in this case using the principle of a green wall, but in this case not a green wall in the way of planters stuck on a wall, but actually a performative screen, which not only has vegetation on it through hydroponic trays, which you see in this section, but it has a system of a misting system built in, which keeps the vale cool during the summer, and allows air to be cooled as it sort of flows through it. And the plants actually grow just through hydroponics because the tray is just drip irrigation, and and it's very minimal. And this can be adjusted both for atmosphere, but also to actually literally cool the building. And every facade is then different, and of course impatient capital. So we had to deliver the building in 18 months, but we convinced the client to give us 2 years to grow the facade, which was made and handcrafted in a small village, employing people locally by the local contractor, using recycled aluminum alloys, and crafting something of a screen on which these plants could actually grow. And so that's what it sort of looks like as a finished product. It also sectionally is performative. It has the social spaces where people can socialize. It has different flowers and plants on different facades, lemongrass base, And sectionally also it's organized based on the requirements of the corporation, but also to perform in terms of extracting hot air. And of course, we didn't meet any of the LEED certification criteria. The building that you see in this image did, and that sort of tells you how ridiculous and how privileged by the green building industry the criteria are. And so it's really about doing something dumb like you see that building, and then a chemical and mechanical fix takes you to and elevates you to getting a certification. So kind of ridiculous. And of course, now in India, we have the Griha certification, which is much more compatible with our needs of passive cooling, often, etc. But the green really becomes the ornament also of the building. And I come back to this image, which, an intern from the office took, and it wasn't sort of even staged. But I come back to this because it really told us many things, because you suddenly realized, and this wasn't intentional, but in reverse, or the feedback loops made us aware of the fact that, two things happened here. One is that the gardeners here were responsible for the facade, which means the identity of the building. So suddenly the identity of the building of this corporation depended on the least paid workers, which is an interesting reversal in terms of the empathy that it creates actually within the organization. And the other was that because you had these hydroponic trays on which the workers or the gardeners could walk free, they could actually access and make eye contact with their bosses. So here you see, the managers sitting and having their conference while they are working, and they kind of coexist in this empathy. In the same way, people could put blinds down to cut them off, but this sort of coexistence is rather beautiful, which is something, again, we hadn't intentionally done, but we have learned from it. And these are sort of images of the building in terms of the way it actually operates with the misting system and the plants. Sorry, this will take a second to start. It's loading up. Yeah, and so I'm sorry, this is going slow. I might just move on. But essentially, to give you a sense of okay, excuse me. Yeah. Sorry, maybe this is not working, but this just shows you the misting system at play, and with the vegetation over time, and how it sort of pans out. But anyway, we'll skip it. It seems to be too heavy. Yeah, and so that's what sort of the building looks like sitting in its context. You can see how differentiated it is from the other buildings. And I'm going to just end with this last project, which is a middle scale project where you have an intersection, I think, in an interesting way between landscape and urban design. Sorry, for some reason the slides seem to be hung. Okay. Yeah. And so this is an interesting project where here, these are our clients, which is, it's a project for 100 elephants, again, in a peri-urban situation outside the city of Jaipur in the desert. And of course, it's in the periphery of Jaipur, so it's not in the city, but it's all becoming slowly urban. And here, of course, this is a larger site. The elephants and the mahouts live here together. The mahouts earn very little, so this is really low-cost housing. It's low-cost housing for them and their elephants. And also, the elephants are here accidentally. It's an accident of history. Tourism. This is from the New York Times, and American tourists feeling like they're Maharajas for a day. The elephants take tourists up to these ramparts. They get painted. Their skin discolors because they don't have enough water. This is how they lived like garages with the mahouts living on top. The mahouts all moved down to live close to them because that relationship is very important. The site that we got, it was a competition, had already been excavated by sand contractors who were selling sand. We made water central to this. And again, we zoomed out to the national sort of territory to understand the position of Rajasthan, where our site was located, what the kind of water catchment potentials were. And of course, this was completely different from what an animal like an elephant needs. And so, of course, we made it a landscape project, and it was then about kind of simulating an environment, but also creating the kind of humidity and wetness perhaps that these creatures would need. A series of micro dams to capture water, looking at Google Earth images, that's sort of the peri-urban condition, and then designing the landscape and then putting the built form in the kind of interstitial spaces, which were not productive in a sense for the landscape, but trying to extend this network of water in the way it flowed in the larger kind of region and settlement. And that was the transformation. It was a long project that went through a whole decade and over for various other reasons which were political. But that hill is the same hill that you see in these three projects, and there's been quite a transformation of the environment. But of course, we also did spend time on the architecture, and basically instead of doing the row houses which were stipulated, we reconfigured it in a way to create a hierarchy of courtyards which come at no cost, but expand the livability of the house tremendously. And so these became, if you imagine three low-cost houses coming together, they become a mansion if the families get on together, because they also have an expanded courtyard that they share, making it an ensemble which is beyond just one unit of 350 square feet. And then, of course, how we use the food storage to create insulation, to create ventilation. And that was the beginnings of the project, the first water body that you see there. And then this is the raw form of the architecture because it hadn't yet been allocated. Now that it's been allocated, people are painting and decorating and transforming it. So these were like imagined as armatures that people would actually colonize. And what's interesting here is, while the middle class in Jaipur have to buy water, suddenly the poorest, and these are really the poorest in terms of what they earn, have more water than they need. So they have lawns, which is the aspiration of every middle class Indian living in Jaipur. But here the poorest have the lawns. They have flowers, they sell flowers, and they have a completely different environment. They have moved their kitchens out into the courtyard, so they have an extra room because the kitchen now can be used by a child to sleep in. And you see the trees, the goats have arrived, the elephants live there. And in some areas where families get on well together, it really does become like an extended big family house as a mansion. You see through that window where the elephant lives. And here the houses again haven't yet been decorated. Now they're beginning to do that. And that's again a before and after transformation of the landscape. And you can see how it moves. Now here again, by default, by privileging water, creating this armature for life, what we also did was something else which one hadn't expected, which is that changed the relationship between the mahout and the elephant, because here you see how their skin gets discolored, and this is a summer shot where the water is at its lowest. But this process of bathing with the mahout, this playfulness, is actually also part of their bonding process, which was not possible earlier because the water didn't exist. And so this sort of intersection, again, in a sense, by default, I'm retrospectively picking up on these lessons, was made a big difference to their relationship. And local species, this is called kikar, which are kind of transforming it. And this last observation, which were these pavilions, this wasn't part of the programs, but the mahout convinced us to do this because they said elephants are social beings and they need to hang out together. And with very residual materials left over from the construction, we made these pavilions where they could be tied together. But again, this became an opportunity for the children of the mahout, who are now teenagers and savvy with social media. They set up a company called Elephantastic, and you could go and pay them 300 rupees to feed the elephants, and if you want to have a bath with the elephants, they would charge you 500 rupees. And now they have a whole business that has emanated from this, which is, and to my mind, really wonderful. Again, nothing we had planned for, but by imagining these spaces as really armatures for life to thrive, where architecture doesn't become the central obsession, where you have these balances in space for landscape, for water, for other ways of imagining these sorts of emerging settlement patterns, which are also cognizant of the fact that you're placing particular humans at the center of this imagination, within a kind of understanding of what I would call the context of the context, which is the socio-economic, cultural context in which the physical context of our intervention sits, I think opens up many possibilities. And, this was a complex project. I won't go into this, but this just shows you timelines, actors involved. The red line indicates our firm, who are the only constants, perhaps with political parties, agencies, and actors changing. So it made for a very complex project, which took a long time, but it also gave us an insight in how one can intervene in these peri-urban areas within the context of that broader imagination of the flux that I was describing in the Indian condition, and create these sort of healthy intersections between architectural planning and landscape imaginations to create, in this case, an interesting habitat for elephants and for their keepers, and how one deploys other forms of infrastructure in order to create a different settlement pattern. And here, this is a little intervention we made. We convinced the government, in fact, it wasn't part of the program, to make a little guest house where scholars and conservationists could actually go and very discreetly live in this environment to study this sort of habitat, and it uses local materials. And here you see the decorations beginning to appear. We were surprised they weren't painting elephants and birds, but we realized later that they told us that what the water and the trees have done is that they've invited birds here, and so now more people are coming to look at the birds in this environment than the elephants, and that was amusing to know. And some parts of the site which are low, where water accumulates naturally, of course, are much denser with vegetation. This is a Photoshop image of what was our aspiration in order to create a kind of wetness on the site, which would change the kind of habitat for these for both the mahots, their families, and the elephants, and of course keeping the next generation in mind to whom we are going to hand the earth over. So with that, I just sort of want to thank you, and I think I come to the end of my presentation, and I just want to say that what I attempted to do was that really try to show how at different scales, different readings and the way we discern them, looking at it through a lens of urbanism and architecture, without, of course, being cognizant of what natural systems we operate in and the role that landscape architecture can play. One has also tried to show you how we've looked at some of our architectural projects and how they get informed with this larger reading of the territory, at least we operate in, and how I think the challenges at looking at transitional landscapes are manifold, but how I think we have to develop this culture that we take on this ambition of imagining the design of transitions in these transitional landscapes, and not premising everything on absolute solutions, which will not have the validity in this understanding of the context that I think now we are engaging with. So with that, thank you very much. Roberto, I can't hear you. I think you might be on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Raul, for your beautiful lecture. A lot of beautiful images and very interesting concepts to together. First of all, I would say that don't worry, your audience is much more mixed. It's not only landscape architects, it's also architects and planners and urban designers. So
thank you.
We use the term landscape in a sort of
A very broad way. Okay.
way, so meaning the surrounding space. And I would like to ask Luigi to recollect questions as soon as he has a chance. And first of all, I just, well, in the meantime, I just want to highlight a few points that were very important to me. I think that your words helped us somehow reformulate the idea of informality and the idea vis-a-vis the idea of permanence in the city, and to use the flow diagrams as a way of mapping meaningfully, not only as graphic ways of expressing simply information, and the necessary integration of the concept of flux and transition in our discussions and in our debates versus the idea of finding definitive solutions. So this is extremely important, and the fact that our reality is very heterogeneous, and we are dealing not only with structure and construction, but also with social schemes and political structures. And we are dealing with this complex reality, which is our work today. So thank you very much for helping us understand and reflect on these issues. I don't see any question coming up. So I would say, okay. So I would say we can leave the debate for the, let's say, final part after the second presentation, because maybe then we will have time to recollect all the questions from the audience. And thanking again Raul for his presentation, I now invite Professor Weller to take the stage.